The gunshot cracked through the Harlem night like a declaration of war. It wasn't loud by accident. It wasn't wild. It was precise. One single report that echoed off brick tenements, rattled storefront glass, and froze every man standing on 133rd Street, where Lenox Avenue narrowed into shadow. For half a second, Harlem stopped breathing. Bumpy Johnson did not flinch. He stood beneath the street lamp, hat brim low, coat buttoned against the cold, his eyes fixed not on the body slumping to the pavement, but on the men who had just realized something had changed forever. The shooter's hand still trembled. The crowd had gone silent. Somewhere a woman screamed from an open window, then slammed it shut, as if fear itself had hands. This wasn't a random killing. This wasn't street chaos. This was a message. Because the man bleeding onto the concrete wasn't just anybody. He was part of Bumpy Johnson's inner circle, a runner trusted with secrets, roots, and names. And now he lay dying in the open, executed clean, efficient, and public. Harlem understood symbols, and this one spoke clearly. Someone had crossed a line, and they wanted Bumpy Johnson to know it. The legend didn't rush to the body. He didn't shout orders. He didn't ask who fired the shot. He already knew this wasn't about rage. It was about power. About challenging the balance that had kept Harlem from burning itself down. He slowly turned his head, scanning the block. Men melted into doorways. Others stared at the ground. Loyalty and fear were sorting themselves in real time. Bumpy's voice finally cut the silence, calm, controlled, and deadly serious. "Everybody go home," he said. "Tonight's over." Nobody questioned him, because when violence happened this clean, this deliberate, it meant the game had shifted. And in Harlem, when the game shifted, men paid attention to who stayed standing. This gunshot would ripple through the streets for decades. But to understand why, you had to understand who Bumpy Johnson was, and why touching his inner circle was more than an insult. It was an invitation to judgment. Years before that gunshot echoed through Harlem, Ellsworth Raymond Johnson had already become something larger than his name. To the streets, he was Bumpy, a man shaped by violence, sharpened by intellect, and feared not because he was loud, but because he was precise. Harlem in those days was a kingdom under siege. The Great Migration had filled the streets with black families fleeing Southern terror, only to find Northern exploitation waiting with cleaner hands. White landlords controlled the buildings, white politicians controlled the law, and white mobsters believed they controlled the money. But Harlem wasn't passive. It was alive with numbers runners, jazz musicians, hustlers, church leaders, and men who understood that power didn't always come from legality. It came from leverage. Bumpy Johnson mastered leverage early. He read books most men on the street couldn't pronounce, quoted philosophy in rooms where guns did the talking. And when he spoke, people listened. Not because he demanded respect, but because he understood consequences better than anyone else in Harlem. He built his reputation carefully. Not as a reckless killer, but as an enforcer of order. Someone who knew that chaos brought heat, and heat brought destruction. Under Bumpy, Harlem's underground functioned with rules. Rules that protected the community even while breaking the law. He paid bail, funded funerals, kept predatory outsiders in check. And most importantly, he protected his people. His inner circle wasn't large. Bumpy didn't trust easily. Every man around him had been tested, not just for courage, but for discipline. Loose talk got men killed. Disloyalty got families erased. And disrespect, when aimed at Bumpy Johnson, carried consequences that unfolded slowly and publicly. That's why the gunshot mattered. Because killing a man in Bumpy's orbit wasn't just murder. It was a declaration that someone believed the legend was vulnerable. The timing made it worse. Pressure had been building for months. The Italian mob wanted more control. Police wanted more arrests. And younger street crews were starting to mistake Bumpy's restraint for weakness. Harlem was tense. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that comes before blood. The man who was shot, his name wouldn't be spoken much after that night out of respect, had been loyal. careful. He wasn't flashy, which meant his death wasn't impulsive. It was planned. Someone had studied Bumpy's operations. Someone had waited for an opening. Someone wanted to send a message that Harlem's balance of power was up for negotiation. They picked the wrong messenger. Because Bumpy Johnson didn't respond to challenges immediately. He observed. He listened. He let people reveal themselves through their reactions. And that night, as the body was carried away and sirens approached from a careful distance, the legend adjusted his hat and walked back into the darkness, already planning how justice would be delivered. Not fast, but permanent. The streets would whisper about that gunshot for years, but the men responsible would learn something much sooner. In Harlem, disrespect didn't always bring instant violence. Sometimes, it brought something far worse. The morning after the gunshot, Harlem didn't wake up. It held its breath. Storefronts opened late. Conversations stayed low. Men who usually lingered on corners kept moving, as if standing still might make them targets. Word had already traveled faster than the police reports ever could. Someone had struck Bumpy Johnson's inner circle and lived through the night. That fact alone made the streets uneasy. Bumpy Johnson sat in the back room of a Lenox Avenue barber shop that doubled as neutral ground. The clippers buzzed out front, jazz hummed softly on the radio, but inside the room there was no music, only smoke, murmurs, and the sound of men choosing their words carefully. Bumpy listened. He always listened first. Faces came and went. Some offered theories. Some offered names they shouldn't have spoken aloud. Bumpy raised a hand once. Not sharply, just enough, and the room fell silent. No guesses, he said. Facts come on their own. That was his way. Rage was inefficient. Panic made mistakes. And whoever had ordered that shooting wanted Bumpy emotional, reactive, exposed. He would give them none of that. What concerned him wasn't just the murder, it was the confidence behind it. The shooter hadn't run wildly. The hit had been clean, controlled, almost professional. That narrowed the field. By noon, the shape of the threat began to emerge. The Italians had been pushing deeper into Harlem again, not openly, not yet, but through proxies. A new crew had surfaced, younger men, backed by outside money, moving fast and sloppy. They talked too much, flaunted too openly, and worse, they believed Harlem could be taken, piece by piece, without consequence. At the center of it all was a man named Vincent Little Vic Moretti. He wasn't a boss, not even close, but he had ambition, backing, and something far more dangerous: permission. The old mafia leadership didn't mind if Little Vic tested Harlem's boundaries. If he failed, he was expendable. If he succeeded, they'd claim the territory. It was a classic move, and Bumpy Johnson recognized it immediately. But there was another possibility, one that sat heavier. Betrayal always came from inside before it showed itself outside. The man who had been killed knew routes, drop times, safe houses. That information didn't float freely, which meant someone close had spoken when they shouldn't have. Bumpy didn't announce this suspicion. He let it hang in the air, unspoken, watching how men reacted when silence stretched too long. Eyes shifted, throats tightened. Truth always leaked through behavior. That afternoon, police pressure arrived, right on schedule. Squad cars rolled through Lenox like they owned it. Plainclothes officers leaned too long against walls. A captain known for his appetite for headlines made a point of being seen. It wasn't coincidence. When violence erupted, law enforcement saw opportunity, not to solve crime, but to disrupt power. Bumpy stood outside a numbers office when the captain approached him, flanked by two officers eager to be noticed. "Johnson," the captain said, voice loud enough for bystanders to hear. "Busy night?" Bumpy looked at him calmly. No smile, no hostility. "Always," he replied. The captain smirked. "Funny thing about chaos," he said. "Sometimes it tells us who's really in charge, and sometimes it tells us who's losing control." The insult hung there. Bumpy stepped closer, just enough to collapse the space between them. His voice remained low. "Control," he said, "is knowing when not to show your hand." The captain laughed, too loudly. "You be careful," he said. "Harlem's changing. Might not be room for old kings much longer." Bumpy watched him walk away. That confirmed it. The police knew something, or thought they did. Either way, the timing aligned too perfectly with the shooting. Someone was feeding information upward or outward, or both. That night, Bumpy convened his inner circle. No grand speeches, no threats, just assignments. Eyes on Little Vic's operation. Quietly. No moves without confirmation. Meanwhile, he ordered audits of his own house, conversations replayed, meetings reconstructed, trust re-examined. This wasn't about revenge yet. This was about clarity. Because Bumpy Johnson understood something many men didn't. The most dangerous moment isn't when blood is spilled. It's when people believe they can spill it without consequence. Harlem had reached that moment. And as days passed, Little Vic grew bolder. His men loitered openly, collected from spots that had once paid Bumpy's people. They talked loudly in bars, let it be known they had protection. That was the real message behind the gunshot. Not just, "We can hurt you," but, "We think you won't respond." The community noticed. Shop owners grew nervous. Old allies asked careful questions. Younger hustlers started watching Little Vic's crew with curiosity. The first crack in loyalty always came from uncertainty. Bumpy saw it all, and still, he waited. Because when he moved, it wouldn't be loud, it wouldn't be chaotic, it would be surgical. The challenge had been issued, not just by a rival crew, not just by the police, but by the idea that Harlem could be taken from the inside. That idea needed to be corrected, and soon, someone would sit across from Bumpy Johnson and realize they had misunderstood him entirely. By the third night, Bumpy Johnson had his answer. It came the way truth often did in Harlem, not through confessions, but through patterns. A missed payment here, a runner who changed routes without instruction, a bar that suddenly stopped passing information along. Small things. But Bumpy had built his empire by noticing small things. The betrayal wasn't dramatic. It never was. It came from a man named Curtis Hale, quiet, efficient, and invisible enough that most people forgot he existed. Curtis handled logistics, safe houses, transit between boroughs, the kind of man who knew everything and said nothing. Until he did. Curtis had been feeding Little Vic details in exchange for protection and a promised exit, a business venture in Brooklyn, backed by Italian money. $50,000 and a clean slate. To Curtis, it probably felt like survival. To Bumpy, it was treason. But Bumpy didn't summon him, didn't confront him, didn't even acknowledge the discovery outwardly. Curtis continued showing up to meetings, passing along information, smiling when appropriate, and Bumpy watched him the way a man watches a clock run down. Meanwhile, Little Vic made his mistake. He wanted recognition. He wanted to be seen not as a proxy, but as a power. So he arranged a sit-down, neutral territory, public enough to discourage violence, private enough to feel official. The message was clear. He believed he had earned a seat at the table. Bumpy agreed. The meeting took place in the back of a closed social club, one of those old Harlem rooms that smelled of whiskey, smoke, and long memory. 2 tables, 1 light overhead, men stationed at measured distances. Little Vic arrived first, flanked by men who tried too hard to look relaxed. He dressed well, spoke loudly, and smiled often. The kind of man who thought confidence could replace experience. When Bumpy entered, the room shifted. No one announced him. No one needed to. He sat across from Little Vic and folded his hands calmly. Little Vic started talking immediately. "Lot of changes lately," he said. "New opportunities, new partnerships." Bumpy didn't respond. "I respect what you built," Little Vic continued. "Truly. But times change. Harlem's getting attention, bigger money, bigger interests. I'm here to make sure everybody benefits." Still nothing. Little Vic leaned forward. "The other night," he said carefully, "was unfortunate. But misunderstandings happen when territory isn't clearly defined. That was when Bumpy finally spoke. "Men don't misunderstand bullets," he said quietly. The temperature dropped. Little Vic smiled tightly. "No disrespect intended," he said. "Just business." Bumpy met his eyes. "Then you should have done better homework." The words landed heavier than shouting ever could. Little Vic laughed, a mistake born of nerves. "Look," he said, "nobody wants a war. Not you, not me. I think we can—" Bumpy raised a hand. "Who told you where my runner would be?" he asked. The question cut clean. Little Vic blinked. "I don't know what you're—" "Who told you?" Bumpy repeated. Silence stretched. Little Vic glanced briefly to his left, not at his men, but toward the door. Bumpy noticed. That told him everything. He stood. "I think we're done here," Bumpy said. "You should enjoy the rest of your evening." Little Vic frowned. "That's it?" Bumpy adjusted his coat. "That's all you get." As Bumpy left the room, he gave a subtle nod to one of his men. The clock had reached 0. That same night, Curtis Hale was approached quietly. No weapons drawn, no raised voices. Just 2 men who told him Bumpy wanted to see him. Curtis knew better than to run. He arrived at a small apartment overlooking the river, a place Bumpy used when he wanted privacy. The city lights flickered below like distant stars. Bumpy poured 2 glasses of whiskey. Curtis didn't touch his. "You could have come to me," Bumpy said calmly. Curtis swallowed. "I was afraid." "Fear is natural," Bumpy replied. "Betrayal is a choice." Curtis broke then. He talked. Names, payments, meetings, confirmed everything Bumpy already knew, and more. When he finished, he looked up, eyes wet. "I never meant for anyone to die." Bumpy nodded once, but someone did. There was no yelling, no violence. Justice didn't always arrive in blood. Curtis was removed from Harlem quietly, permanently. His name erased from conversations, his future confiscated. The next morning, Little Vic woke up to a city that felt different. His spots stopped paying, his phones went unanswered, his protection vanished. And then came the message. Not delivered with violence, delivered with precision. A single envelope arrived at his club. Inside it, a list of every transaction Curtis had ever shared, annotated. Dates, times, witnesses, and one final line, written cleanly at the bottom. "You should have stayed in Brooklyn." Little Vic understood. The gunshot had been a challenge. What followed was education. But Harlem hadn't seen the final lesson yet, because Bumpy Johnson hadn't responded publicly, and when he did, it would reset the balance forever. The public reckoning came a week later, exactly when Bumpy Johnson wanted it to. Harlem had begun to buzz again, but the sound was different now. It wasn't fear, it was anticipation. People could feel that something unresolved still hung in the air, like heat trapped between buildings. Too many things had gone quiet too fast. Little Vic's crew had faded, but no one had seen them fall. In Harlem, when men disappeared without noise, it usually meant something worse was coming. The setting was deliberate. A community fundraiser at a church hall near 135th Street. One of those events where politicians shook hands, police smiled for photographs, and neighborhood leaders pretended the city cared more than it did. Bumpy Johnson attended these things not for appearances, but for positioning. Authority liked to perform respect in public. Bumpy liked to test how far it actually went. The hall was full. Folding chairs, banners, donation jars. A jazz trio played softly near the stage. White officials stood stiffly among black community leaders, uncomfortable but smiling. Cameras flashed. And then Little Vic arrived. He didn't expect to see Bumpy Johnson there. The moment their eyes met across the room, Little Vic understood he had been invited, not to a negotiation, but to a verdict. Bumpy stood near the back, speaking quietly with an elderly pastor. He wore a dark suit, immaculate, calm. No entourage, no visible weapons, just presence. Little Vic hesitated, then forced himself forward. Pride demanded it. He approached with a strained smile. "Mr. Johnson," he said loudly enough for nearby ears. "Didn't know this was your kind of gathering." Bumpy turned slowly. "Harlem is always my kind of gathering," he replied. The pastor excused himself instinctively. Little Vic leaned in. "I got your message," he said. "Clever. But you and I both know this ends one way or another." Bumpy's gaze didn't waver. "It already ended." Little Vic scoffed. "Funny. Feels like you're avoiding something." That was when Bumpy raised his voice. Not shouting, just enough to carry. "Captain," he said. Across the room, the same police captain from Lenox Avenue stiffened. Slowly, reluctantly, he turned. Bumpy gestured lightly. "Would you join us?" The room went quiet. The captain walked over, face tight. "What is this, Johnson?" Bumpy looked between the two men now, street ambition and state authority standing inches apart. "This man," Bumpy said evenly, "believes he has protection." Little Vic opened his mouth. Bumpy raised a finger. "And you," Bumpy continued, turning to the captain, "believe you have leverage." The captain bristled. "Watch your tone." Bumpy nodded. "Fair enough. Let's speak plainly." He reached into his coat and produced copies, documents, photographs, transcripts. He handed them to the captain first. Evidence Curtis Hale had provided, payoffs, meetings, names, including police intermediaries who had quietly ensured Little Vic's operations went untouched. The captain's face drained of color as he flipped through the pages. Then Bumpy handed a second set to Little Vic. Silence fell like a verdict. "You see," Bumpy said calmly, "when you killed my man, you thought I'd answer with noise, violence. That's what men like you expect." He stepped closer. "I answered with truth." Little Vic's bravado collapsed. "You don't walk away from this," he hissed. Bumpy looked at him with something close to pity. "I already have." The captain snapped the folder shut. Cameras were turning now, whispers spreading. "You set me up," the captain said. Bumpy smiled faintly. "You set yourself up the moment you confused tolerance with weakness." The captain realized the trap too late. Any move against Bumpy now would expose everything. Any protection for Little Vic would tie him directly to corruption. Power had shifted, publicly, irreversibly. Security moved in. Not for Bumpy, for Little Vic. As he was escorted out, he locked eyes with Bumpy one last time. Hatred, fear, and understanding all fighting for dominance. "You could have stayed small," Little Vic spat. Bumpy replied quietly, "You could have stayed alive." The fundraiser continued awkwardly after that. Applause resumed, music played, but everyone in that hall understood they had just witnessed something historic. No gunshots, no bodies, just power, rearranged. Outside, Harlem exhaled. Word spread within hours. The betrayal exposed, the rival neutralized, the police embarrassed without a single arrest made. Bumpy Johnson walked through the streets that night unbothered. Men nodded, women smiled, elders whispered blessings. The gunshot that had started everything had finally landed where it was meant to, and Harlem remembered who truly held the line. The aftermath did not arrive with sirens. It arrived with silence. The day after the fundraiser, Little Vic's name vanished from Harlem like it had never belonged there in the first place. His clubs shut their doors without explanation. His runners found new work or left town. Phones that once rang without pause went unanswered. Even his allies avoided speaking his name aloud, as if words themselves could bring consequence. That was the kind of justice Bumpy Johnson believed in. Not spectacle. Erasure. The police captain took a sudden leave of absence. Officially, it was health-related. Unofficially, everyone understood he had been cornered. Investigations began quietly, away from headlines. Files moved from desks to boxes. Promotions stalled. A man who had once walked Lenox Avenue like a conqueror now avoided Harlem entirely. Authority had learned its lesson, and Harlem noticed. For the community, the relief came gradually. Numbers spots reopened under familiar management. Shop owners felt safe enough to extend credit again. Conversations returned to full volume. Music spilled out of clubs late into the night. Order had been restored, not imposed, but reclaimed. Bumpy Johnson never announced victory. He didn't need to. He spent the week visiting people the city ignored, widows, small business owners, families shaken by the tension. He paid for the funeral of the man who had been killed, privately, respectfully. No speeches, no names spoken. That, too, was part of justice. His inner circle gathered again in the barbershop back room, but the atmosphere had changed. Men sat straighter, listened harder. Trust, once cracked, had been reforged, tempered by consequence. No one mentioned Curtis Hale. Absence spoke loudly enough. One of the younger men finally asked the question lingering in everyone's mind. "Why not kill them?" he asked quietly. Bumpy met his eyes. "Because fear fades," he said. "Respect lasts." He understood something few men did. Violence created martyrs. Precision created lessons. Little Vic lived, but stripped of relevance, protection, and credibility. A man alive, but finished. That fate spread faster than any bullet ever could. Other crews took notice. The mafia recalibrated. Harlem was no longer considered soft ground. And the police learned that public humiliation, when delivered cleanly, could be more damaging than defiance. The balance had shifted, not toward chaos, but toward equilibrium. Years later, elders would say that was the moment Harlem stopped being hunted from the inside. Because one gunshot had threatened to unravel everything, and one measured response had stitched it back together. History rarely records moments the way the streets remember them. Official files would never mention that fundraiser. Newspapers wouldn't connect a single gunshot on 133rd Street to the sudden collapse of an outside operation. Police reports would talk around the truth, not through it. But Harlem remembered. They remembered how close everything had come to tearing itself apart, and how quietly it had been pulled back from the edge. From that moment on, Bumpy Johnson was no longer just an operator or an enforcer. He became a stabilizing force, a man whose presence meant order, not because he demanded obedience, but because he enforced balance. Territory lines held. Disputes were brought to him before they became problems. Even rivals began to respect the rules of engagement he represented. Harlem had found something rare in those years, a man who understood power and restraint. Younger hustlers studied that week the way students studied scripture. They learned that strength wasn't always loud, that the sharpest response didn't always draw blood, that sometimes the most devastating move was allowing your enemy to fully expose themselves. Bumpy Johnson became legend not through domination, but through clarity. When outsiders tested Harlem again, and they always did, the question wasn't, "Who controls this?" It was, "Would Bumpy allow it?" That question alone ended more conflicts than violence ever could. The community thrived in that space. Music flourished. Businesses survived. Harlem, for a time, belonged to itself, and it all traced back to one gunshot, not because of who fired it, but because of how Bumpy Johnson answered it. He had turned an act of aggression into a public lesson, a betrayal into a warning, a challenge into a confirmation of authority. That was the difference between a gangster and a legend. The man who had been killed that night became part of Harlem's unspoken history, remembered not for how he died, but for what his death revealed. His loyalty had mattered, and loyalty, in Bumpy's world, was never forgotten. As the years passed, stories grew. Embellishments crept in. That was inevitable, but the core remained true. When Harlem stood on the brink, Bumpy Johnson didn't reach for chaos. He reached for control, and in doing so, he changed how power moved through the city. Not forever, but long enough to matter. This wasn't just about a gunshot. It was about what happens when a community realizes how close it came to losing itself, and who stepped forward to stop it. The night that bullet echoed through Harlem, men thought violence had spoken first. But history would remember something different. It would remember restraint, intelligence, and a kind of authority that didn't need permission from the law or approval from the streets. Bumpy Johnson understood something most men never learn. Power isn't proven by how quickly you strike. It's proven by how completely you finish the matter. He didn't answer disrespect with rage. He didn't answer betrayal with chaos. He answered it with exposure, precision, and justice that couldn't be argued with. That gunshot could have fractured Harlem. Instead, it revealed who truly held it together. Because legends aren't born in moments of comfort. They're forged when pressure closes in from every side, when authority watches, enemies circle, and the streets wait to see who breaks first. Bumpy didn't break. He reminded everyone, rivals, police, and even his own people, that respect is not something you demand. It's something you enforce, quietly, consistently, and without apology. This wasn't about ego. It wasn't about revenge. It was about dignity. And in Harlem, dignity meant survival. That's why decades later, people still speak his name with weight. Not because of how many men he defeated, but because of how many disasters he prevented. The gunshot changed Harlem forever, not because it was fired, but because of how a legend chose to answer it.